Good evening. Welcome. Welcome to Bill's Design Talks. And thank you all very much for coming and coming in during this very beautiful summer evening to join us. I'm Kara McCarty. I'm the Curatorial Director of Cooper-Hewitt, and I'm sitting in this evening for Bill Moggridge. Before we begin, I would like to thank WNYC Green Space for being very generous with us all year, helping to host these events. Cooper-Hewitt is on the move. We're undergoing a major renovation, and the museum itself is closed, but we've been looking for partners around the city to host events with us, and WNYC has been very generous. Last fall, we were at the United Nations. We had an exhibition there. We just opened up a design center in Harlem at 110th Street. And then this summer, we have an exhibition on Governor's Island, which is what we'll be talking about this evening. Tonight's will be the last in this season's Bill's Design Talks. And for tonight, we're going to celebrate our exhibition, Graphic Design, Now in Production, on view in Governor's Island all summer. In fact, I hope some of you have already been there. I'd like to just show this wonderful catalog that was created for the exhibition. I think it has about 1,000 images in it, but it's an excellent compendium. It's an excellent document of where graphic design now is today and for about the last 10 years, and it gives hints of where we're going. So please have a look. It's on sale at Graphic Design Now. On Governor's Island. Also, beginning this weekend on Governor's Island, we're partnering with the Corning Museum of Glass with an event called Glass Lab. It's essentially a hot shop on wheels that they travel around. It was just been set up on Governor's Island this weekend, and they have invited graphic designers whose work is in the Graphic Design Now exhibition to make glass, and none of them have worked in glass before, so it's really a very exciting time for them. It's really interesting to see how they create these forms with this living material. Governor's Island is open only on the weekends, Saturdays and Sundays. There's a free ferry from Lower Manhattan and also from Brooklyn, and come and join us on the beautiful island. The exhibition was co-organized by the Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum and the Walker Art Center. The show opened in Minneapolis at the Walker Art Center last fall, and after New York's showing, which closes September 3rd, it travels on to Los Angeles to the Hammer Museum, and then onward to some additional venues. Tonight's program features a conversation with Andrew Blauvelt, who, together with art curator Ellen Lupton, organized the exhibition, and designer Dimitri Nieuwenhuizen. Tonight's event has been funded by Adobe and in part by the Netherlands American Foundation and public funds from the Netherlands Cultural Services. Special thanks to the Consulate General of the Netherlands here in New York City. The program is online and streamed live, so if you have missed past events and you would like to tune in, go to cooperhewitt.org or YouTube. And after I introduce our guests tonight, they will each make a very brief presentation about how new tools and methods are changing the field of graphic design. After that, we'll have a very brief conversation, a Q&A amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up to all of you, and we welcome comments. Comments and questions. Andrew Blauvelt is Curator of Architecture and Design and Chief of Communications and Audience Engagement at the Walker Art Center. In 2009, Cooper-Hewitt awarded the Walker our National Design Award for institutional and corporate achievement. In addition to being a renowned curator and critic, Andrew is a practicing graphic designer, and his work has received more than 100 design awards and has been profiled in magazines including ID, Surface, Print, and Metropolis. His work has been exhibited in many museums worldwide, including the Cooper-Hewitt. Our second guest is Dimitri Nieuwenhuizen, who has just arrived from Holland to join us this evening. And we're very grateful. He's made this trip. He's actually jetting back tomorrow. So we're grateful for the both of them for coming in for tonight's event. Dimitri is a partner in the graphic and interactive design studio Lust, whose projects explore new uses for digital media. Lust's Posterwall for the 21st century is among the most exciting pieces in our graphic design exhibition on Governor's Island, allowing users to interact with randomly generated posters as well as trigger new designs via Twitter. So Andrew's going to tell you more about the exhibition, Dimitri more about Lust's work. So please welcome me in joining both of them.
Oh my. Thank you, Cara. You can adjust it? Oh. I better start my clock. We're surrounded by clocks, so hopefully something will go right. As Cara mentioned, I was going to do a little kind of introduction, I think, to something that would be more specific once you be able to see less specific projects. I think that will hopefully make some sense. But just as an overview, Ellen Lupton and I started this undertaking about 3 years ago now, maybe even longer. And it's always quite grueling because we have similar backgrounds because Ellen's also a designer turned curator, and then a graphic designer, I should say. And when you're a graphic designer, you're trying to do a graphic design show, it's kind of doomed from the beginning because you know too many people, you know too many things, and there's a lot of expectation. And there hadn't been a show until I think the last one was actually the last major museum show was Mixing Messages at the Cooper-Hewitt in '96. I think I have that right. And then before that, the first major museum graphic design show in the United States was at the Walker Art Center called Graphic Design in America, and that was in 1989. So it's been these long stretches for these museum-based graphic design shows. So that put a little bit more pressure on us. But we also wanted to figure out the first thing you do as a curator is figure out, well, is there any brackets to what you're talking about in terms of time? And we thought that we would start maybe. We put one line in the sand over here at 2000, the year 2000, and then another one kind of when we started, which was, I guess, 3 years ago, but we kept moving it, of course, as it gets more closer, you want to put more and more new things in. And we cheated a little bit, so if you're really diligent in the show, you'll find that there's some late 90s work in there that we thought was really prescient for what was going to be really talked about. And it was also very interesting to try to do this because it becomes a kind of summary of the field itself. And it's a field that I practice in, but the field has changed even so much during those 10 years, let alone back when I started doing this, more than about 25 years ago. I don't know if this will work, so I'm going to go. So what I was going to do, so the show has about 500 plus pieces in it for about 250 or more designers from around the world. And we use the term designer with maybe a lowercase g because some of those pieces are designed by people who maybe don't call themselves designers. They might go by just their names, or they might go by a different kind of professional title. Although, of course, the bulk of the work is produced by professional graphic designers. And it's divided up into different genres. And if you haven't seen the show, I would highly encourage it. If for no other reason, then you should go to Governor's Island because it has the most spectacular views of Manhattan. And you get to have the fun ferry ride. But we picked the typical formats of graphic design, such as posters, books, magazines, film titles, identity programs or logos. And I think there are about 7 or 8 categories total. And we did that for a particular reason, because we felt like this is how the public understands or comes to see or view graphic design. Although graphic design is no longer limited to just those artifacts anymore. In fact, designers are called upon to do all sorts of things, sometimes simultaneously create an identity for a program, create a website, create some motion graphics, create a poster for it. And so it's much more fluid, even though those categories might seem a little artificial. So for tonight, because the exhibition is so vast, we thought it would be fun to look at a specific aspect that's brought up in the show and also in the catalog. The catalog, this is actually a cropped image of the catalog, so we're not missing any information I didn't intend for you to see right now. But this was an essay that I wrote for the catalog called Tool, or Post-Production for the Graphic Designer. This is the complete spread in case if you're anxious graphically and want to know what that full page looks like. And the book is filled with all of these little bits of information that are kind of riffs on some of the main content. We thought maybe our younger readers wouldn't want to pour through 2,000 or more than that, 4,000 word essays, but might want a little bit of relief along the way. The subtitle is actually a reference to this book called Production for the Graphic Designer. And if you're old like me, this will probably haunt your memories. It haunts mine for sure. I hated production class in school because it consisted of the instructor reading verbatim from this book for an hour and a half every week. But this was a book that James Craig put together in this edition that we're showing is from 1974. And this was, introducing the aspects of technical reproduction for the graphic designer. And even at that time, the field had splintered apart between people like what were called keyline artists and production artists. People who actually did what was called paste up, and people doing art direction and actual design and typesetting. So at this moment in the field, there's a high level of specialization, and like many other fields, there's many other subfields that go along and become part of it. Why is this in here? Well, I'll just make an aside. This isn't our slide. The catalog design itself was based on the notion of the Whole Earth Catalog, and in particular, we were focused on the subtitle of the Whole Earth Catalog, which was called Access to Tools. And for those of you who and I'm not old enough to remember this, thank God. The Whole Earth Catalog was a kind of alternative. It was access to information and technologies and new kinds of ways of doing things, like almost like a do-it-yourself culture for the counterculture in the 1960s. So this appeared in the late 1960s, and this was the last Whole Earth Catalog, although it really wasn't the last one, but this was from the early 1970s. And the Whole Earth Catalog is an aggregation of all of these different bits of information and different technologies. And Steve Jobs famously at Stanford University was referencing this particular book, which was kind of edited, I guess, or organized by Stuart Brand, and describing it to younger students as the Google of its day. So if you wanted to know about anything, you sort of looked at that. But this notion of tool is something, of course, that's very integral to the notion of design itself, whether it's graphic design or whether it's industrial design. In fact, I would argue for any kind of design. And what is design? It's the man-made environment. And this is actually, I put this in here for the Cooper-Hewitt's enjoyment. This is actually a collage by Hans Hollein, and it was created on the occasion of the founding of the Cooper-Hewitt and their show, a very amazing show that they had at their launch in 1976 called Man Transforms. And so it's a good example, actually, of an architect employing the means of visual communication to make his point. This is a more recent work, but by recent, I mean 1975. And this is by Ed Fella, who many of you may know. He's an artist that's featured in the exhibition. He currently lives in Los Angeles, and he is had a very long career. He's about in his 70s now. And this is a collage that was made as a kind of moving announcement. He was working in the commercial. He was a commercial artist, quote unquote, in the Detroit area at Skidmore Serration, which is a famous kind of agency in Detroit. And this was the moving announcement that he did, which was a collage. And his famous joke at looking at this is that the only thing left is coffee. Which, if you're a graphic designer, you would understand that all of these tools have disappeared from the desktop and is completely changed, except for, of course, coffee. So it's always the constant. And that's because of this thing. The Macintosh computer, which was launched in 1984 by Apple, which promised which suddenly integrated all of those previous tools. Let's see if I can go backwards. So all those tools essentially and more were suddenly part of this device, which is in itself is a kind of meta tool. By that we mean a tool that's able to create other tools. One of the unfortunate consequences of that is that your very organic desktop working space filled with real materials and tools, the implements that we think of as tools, was suddenly transformed into this bureaucratic landscape called a desktop with file folders and trash cans and ticking time bombs, if you remember that. So it was kind of a sad but very handy visual metaphor for an interface. But this one I thought you would enjoy too. This is desktop publishing circa 1982. It's great fashion. This is desktop fashions from the 1980s. So we found this image. But this is the great promise, right? That this computer would be able to handle, you could be able to integrate images and typesetting into one document. And so hence the promise of desktop publishing, which is kind of ironic because it wasn't really connected up to much other than a one-color laser printer. So the whole notion of publishing actually didn't really take off until much more recently when we have distributed systems for producing, say, print on demand or things like Lulu.com. But more recently, the notion of designers have really returned, I think a younger generation of designers has returned to the actual means of production. So this has meant a resurgence in things like letterpress printing or silkscreen, kind of what some might think of as anachronistic kinds of technologies, but very much driven by the notion that of immediacy within that production circuit. I can make it, I can pull the print, I can have it in my hands. And this is actually Ellen's quite pivotal essay from 1998 called The Designer as Producer, which kind of theoretically fuels the whole notion of the show, at least curatorially. The equivalent today, so this goes along the lines of that older technologies, more analog technologies are being recuperated, revived. This is actually a risograph, which is a high-speed duplicating machine. This has become very popular over the last, say, 10 years or maybe a little bit less. And it still exists in the world because it took the place of the mimeograph machine, if you remember that from school with the purple and the fumes you could get high from if you were in the wrong room at school. So this device, which is essentially like a digital duplicator, took its place, and they still exist. I think largely from my own research because of megachurches, because you need like 5,000 copies of that hymnal every Sunday. So there's a whole other marketplace that's that has grown up around this, from graphic designers exchanging like toner cartridges and spare parts to keep these things going. And so this is a set of posters in the exhibition by Albert Xergen from Vienna, and this is called a series called Iconic TV. And these are quite a quintessential, I think, because they're very funny in a way because he's kind of obsessed with American pop culture and television culture, and they're kind of simple graphic in that kind of Max Bill, Joseph Mueller-Brockman tradition of Swiss poster design, but very much this injection of humor makes it much less sober. But what's interesting about these is that one, that they're self-initiated, but two, that they exist as print-on-demand posters. So if you want a set of these, there's about 55 in the series, you can order them up, and that's all handled via the internet. And this is a total transformation in terms of designers producing work and then finding audiences for that work via the internet and using distributed tools like print-on-demand houses. I'm just going to jump ahead here a little bit. The tools, the idea of a tool, though, is by its very nature changing some aspects of design practice. And one of the big kind of debates now within the graphic design community is this notion of crowdsourcing. And by that, it generally means that there are people out there who are creating websites where people can submit logos, for example, and then as a potential customer can come there and pick one out, and for like $99 you can get your logo done. Of course, it's has all the credibility of a $99 logo, but perhaps if you're a small business, that's exactly what you need. But there's another kind of notion of crowdsourcing I think is much smarter, and this is, there's a couple projects in the show, and they all happen to be video projects, music video projects. One of them is a couple of videos by Aaron Koblin and Chris Milk. Chris Milk is a video producer, director, and Aaron Koblin's a programmer, an artist, net artist, creative coder, data visualization person, if you will. And the two projects they created, which probably you have seen, is the Johnny Cash project, which was which allowed users to take a still frame of the video that was supplied and then try and kind of draw over that, or use it as a kind of template, or draw their own image for it, and then submit that image, upload that image, and then the computer will compile it as part of the sequence, because remember, like, video is made of a series of so many frames per second. The other famous project that they've done is for Arcade Fire, called The Wilderness Downtown. And this was created exploiting the properties of Google Chrome when it was released as a browser. So in this case, what you do is it prompts you to type in your childhood address, and then using data from Google Maps, it will input that personalized information and integrate it into the storyline of the video. And another interesting project in this vein that's a little bit less known in the United States is the project by Roel Wouters and Jonathan Puckey for a band in the Netherlands. And this is one frame of fame is what it's called. And this utilizes the webcam that's quite ubiquitous now on all laptops and desktop computers. And here, much like the Cash project, they supply a gesture. And so, and these are the people making these hand gestures in the little boxes. The band members are on the left, and then the supplied webcam images from various contributed users are on the right. And then these are stitched together again. So I think the version that we're showing in the show has 37,000 contributions as part of that. And then other examples of crowdsourced kind of material after the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, for example, Greenpeace. I think Greenpeace UK sponsored this effort to rebrand, or kind of tar and feather, BP's logo. And this existed as a Flickr set. Or in the presidential election, the past presidential election, the very well-designed Obama logo was then, as a kind of meme, was picked up and used in all sorts of things, if you remember. So we have some cookies, and we have a jack-o'-lantern, a pumpkin, as part of that. So it's this adaptation of it. And that kind of gets into the second part of the title, the subtitle, which is this idea of post-production. So if the first kind of phase of graphic design was about using the tools and the means to reproduce the intended image, what we mean by post-production is a little bit of a fancier way of saying that there's an element of appropriation going on, and kind of dipping into a much larger cultural milieu. So the set of small squares of the black and white T-shirts and the colored T-shirts, this is another kind of meme project. Originally, the original design were the names of the Beatles. By Experimental Jet Set. And then this kind of took off on its own. It wasn't intended this way by the designers, but it became its own kind of meme. And then you still see these shirts today where people have adopted that kind of linguistic structure as part of it. And then some of the other projects on the page are these smaller publications. Some of the more interesting ones are the Cyan book is actually a famous book about making your own living structure. So this is kind of one of those examples of this kind of hippie alternative counterculture where you could take cinder blocks and some wood beams and kind of make this kind of cool space for you to kind of hang out or live in. This is being adopted by Urs Lenny, who's a graphic designer in Switzerland. And it's a bootleg edition. So it's being copied, and it's in that blue color, which is a typical color of these kind of risographs. But then I think he's kind of has some ethical concerns because apparently he won't sell it to you, but he'll trade it with you. So it won't have a monetary exchange. And the little book that's sitting next to it, which says The Simple White Band, is actually a project from the United States. This is from Winterhouse Editions. This is Bill Gentell and Jessica Helfand and Winterhouse Studios. This was published I want to say in 2004. Could that be right? 2004. And this was the security. This is the. These are the official government documents that actually would become later known as the Bush Doctrine, which allowed the United States to kind of invade Iraq and in Afghanistan and other countries as well. But what was interesting about this is that all government documents, of course, they don't hold the copyright because we own the government, right? So you can download this information, and that's what they did, and they retypeset it and they published it as a small book and distributed it around bookstores, especially on the East Coast. But it was a really interesting action by which a designer would take essentially copyright-free information and put it back out into the public sphere, because this is the same moment where a lot of media outlets were not questioning anything about that shift in policy, and they were quite upset with that. But like, who can be a designer now? This is I'm forgetting his name, Hans Rosling, who is a professor in Sweden of public health, who developed a piece of software called Gapminder. And this is this famous clip where he does the play-by-play. He's quite an amazing kind of personality, so it kind of fits him perfectly. This was done, actually. This is a still from a BBC documentary using holographic projection, but it's still using his software. But I think my point is that here is somebody who's basically a scientist who's creating his own tools for data visualization, right, for a very specific purpose. And then Google ends up buying Gapminder, actually, so then it becomes more publicly available. Or this is David McCandless, who's a journalist, who was originally a journalist out of England, who now has found as kind of new, a key player in what we call visual journalism, which is the transformation of a lot of news and information into data visualizations. I mean, as we read less text and we become more reliant on these kinds of arguments. And this is a series that he did, and this is just one example called Mountains Out of Molehills. And this looks at media scare stories since the year 2000 up to, I think, about 2010. So it went from like basically Y2K, if you remember that one, to swine flu, or bird flu, sorry. And so he's kind of graphing like how many deaths actually occur versus the total number of media stories related to that. But again, a journalistic background. And this is the most prolific. This is Christophe Spetzel, who's originally from Belgium, but now lives in the UK. He's kind of known for he's the holder of the title for the most, designer for the most heavy metal band logos. And time we did the book, it was about 7,000, so it might be more than that now. And he's kind of created that specific look that a lot of tattoo artists are now indebted to over the years. But these are all done by hand and pencil. And ink. He doesn't use the computer, but instead he's creating these identities. He's not trained. He studied actually forestry science. And then maybe I end with this one, which is an example of, it's actually an artist, Trevor Peglin, who's been collecting these. These are military patches, but they're for black ops military groups. So this is the strange phenomenon in the times that we live in which the notion of branding has become so ubiquitous, this idea of the need to identify, that you would have groups that shouldn't technically exist, that we should not know about, who nevertheless feel compelled to identify themselves, maybe not completely, but at least to each other. But again, that exists, and these are not designed by official designers for the government, and they're not registered with the official military heraldry, which actually there is an office of. But these exist independently of that, so he scours flea markets and other places looking for this material. And I think this leads up to the notion of that we talked about it earlier. When the Macintosh computer became a kind of meta tool, it created a unique opportunity in which the designer in today's age can become himself a tool maker. This is the image of Jörg Lenny, who is the author of Scriptographer, which is used in this case in his robotic spray painting machine. So what it does basically translates vectors and vector art into other kinds of devices, usually very analog, fairly crude devices, because Jörg is very much interested in the gap between sort of digital perfection and these other things. So the dripping spray paint or chalk on chalkboard. Or in this case, this is a vinyl cutting machine, which maybe some of you graphic designers would know. So this is what you put the little letters on the wall with. But it's been adapted. It's been hacked, so it cuts through the paper. So it makes die-cut posters. So the user can type in, and we have this on Governor's Island, so you can make your own poster, maybe one per person. It's very popular. But you can type in your text. It automatically has a typesetting kind of program within it, and then it cuts it and gives you a copy. This is another project that also uses Scriptographer by Jonathan Puckey called Text Pencil. And the best way to describe this is it's a piece of software application that, if you think about a pen, like a fountain pen being loaded with ink, instead your cursor gets loaded with text. So you can upload the Word document to your text, and as you move the cursor across the screen, the letters flow out of it, so to speak. So it has a very organic baseline, depending how much coffee you've had in it. So I'm just going to jump ahead here. This notion extends also to graphic identities. This is Seok Min from Korea. This is the identity they created for the Guggenheim Lab series. And here, the identity, the logo, is actually made up of queries online that ask people, in this case, they're asking about the idea of comfort in the city. And so people's responses actually make up the logo. You can see a little bit of detail there. And this is really strong within the notion of data visualization, graphic designers who now track all aspects of their consumption and issue annual reports, personal annual reports on all of this. And then this is Nicholas Felton, and he actually created his own tool called Datum, which is an iPhone app, so he could better track all of that, because he used to have to keep all the receipts and analyze all of this stuff like people do their taxes. So now there's a software app that you can have for that in case you want it. And then I'm going to end with this, because this is the transition to the project. This is actually the Posterwall for the 21st century, as it was installed in Minneapolis. But since Dimitri will tell you more about that, I think I'll stop here and let him take over. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. And thanks for being here this beautiful day. The weather is really nice here, I must say. In Holland, we're not having a very nice summer until now, so I wish I could stay longer. But we're not going to talk about the weather. I'd like to show you a bit about the how and why we invent tools that lead to design in the end. And I'm going to show a lot of snapshots, quick snapshots of our work and stuff that inspires us. And I hope, that this will show a little bit why we think the development of tools is very important for designers. I want to start with two short fragments that I'll explain later. The Aleph's diameter was probably little more than an inch, but all space was there, actual and undiminished. Each thing was infinite things, since I distinctly saw it from every angle of the universe. So that's a part of the short story The Aleph from Georges Louis Borg. And it's about how simultaneously you can have an end and a beginning of time and space. How you can have, how everything comes together at one point, which makes you ask questions to yourself, but also to the work you make. And the first thing you saw, of course, was like from Stanley Kubrick and from The Dawn of Man, from the movie Space Odyssey, where he makes like the famous jump cut from, let's say, maybe the first tool of mankind, or at least it led to mankind. Well, from the bone all the way to like the spacecrafts that we're building now. And Lust is, we started 15 years ago with Jeroen Barendse and Thomas Castro. And we're a graphic and interactive design studio. And a few years ago we started Lust Lab, where we try to experiment with new tools and new technologies to find new forms of communication, which I think is really important for also the development of ourselves. Well, to put this a bit in perspective, Andrew was already mentioning some history of graphic design. I'm going to go a bit further back, about 13.7 billion years when the universe was created, and then Earth came, and then the multicellular organisms came, and then only 200,000 years ago we started to communicate with each other by talking, and only 6,000 years ago we invented like the first forms of the alphabet, like the cuneiform, you say it in English, I think, and only 2,000 years ago we started to print stuff with woodblock printing. And only 21 years ago, like the HTML or the protocol was invented, and only 2 years ago we had the iPad that everybody's talking about now. So things are kind of like going fast, but at the same time, things take time, which is I think interesting if you think of your own work and put it in perspective. Like for example, here you see like the cuneiform versus the alphabet, which is about less than 2,000 years old. But also the medium is changing a lot, of course. The technique behind the medium is changing a lot. But also, like, for example, here you see on the left for you see like the palimpsest, which is a piece of skin from a goat, like, let's say, a manuscript. What people did, because this was so valuable, like after a while, and they thought the information wasn't that interesting anymore, they scraped it a bit off, and then it could be reused. But this is actually a famous one, because this is from Archimedes, or at least they found that there was information from Archimedes on it. Later on, people erased that and put like religious stuff on it. But they managed to recover it and found like actually really important work of Archimedes. So it's interesting how things are reused. But nowadays, of course, we do the same with hard disks or videotapes or things like that, where we erase them and rewrite them, etc., etc. So also like how we share information. Like on the left, you see like the book from Nicholas Klopper from the 15th century, where he tried to gather all the information of the world into one book, and even started to draw like pipelines to connect this information to each other. Well, great attempt, but he had to wait till the thing on the right, like the first, we can say, like website from Tim Berners-Lee that he developed in CERN in Switzerland. We already know from Ernest Hemingway that you don't need a lot of text to tell a story. 6 words in total. And that kind of turned out to be true. How you see how like this medium developed from like books to like emails, and in the end we're just twittering with a few words. But also like from film to like 12 seconds on YouTube or something like this. And of course, Andrew was already mentioning it, like the machine itself, like from big mainframe machines. And now we're in the era of like the cell phones and the iPads, but soon this will disappear too, and we'll have like basically nothing. It will be invisible. This means that we are changing too as human beings. This is a good example of how like little kids, of course, already like, without any trouble find their way with digital stuff and get in trouble with paper stuff. And it's actually seriously true that our brains are slowly changing using these new kind of technologies. And it's not going that fast, of course, but we will adapt to things. I mean, that's kind of like something that human beings are really good at, in adapting new things that come to them. But still, there's one problem, and I'd like to illustrate that with this short piece of movie.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
That's right, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I
Well,
was
you get the
planting
point.
my petunias in the potting shed.
And be honest,
Constable,
I'm sure you didn't
arrest
notice all of them.
Lady Smythe.
So like these tools, I think we really need them because there's so much information coming towards us. So we need like new stuff that's going to help us like figuring out what information is important for us and what is not. Because we cannot focus on a million things at the same time. We cannot like look at the whole internet to find out what's interesting for us. And you know, although like we have like great search engines for a while, but we don't have any find engines yet. So that's kind of like a problem. So we're trying to think of things like, you know, how can you use the internet really as a tool? Like, for example, by analyzing the text and image that's on it. But then you got to figure out, like, in a good way, like, what is this? What is text actually? It's not just like information. It's also a form of poetry or it's an emotion. So what happens when you digitalize that? It's kind of like reverse engineering of language. And then I'm mentioning several like methods like that you can use from a technical point of view to do that. And just to give you some quick examples, like if you take any article on and you would like check on Twitter for every word how many times people are talking about that, you kind of get like, you know, how relevant each word is of the article. Or if you would combine it with like theories of emotions, then you would get things like this, where like each word gets like color coded. So like the word on the left with the gray is fog, and the one on the right is like porn. Then text would actually look like this. So you could use these colors to do other things with these words. They get like an emotional value, which they, in a different way than they would have had without these colors. Or if you, for example, use the Twitter combination information, like you see here. This is London, and you can just, this is kind of a quick tool that we made where you can like type any word, and it will look at like how many times and how often people are twittering about it at what location. And this helps you, for example, to start stuff like this. So you can look at a specific location, and you look like, so what are people talking about? But you can also add an emotion to that. So do they actually like it? So if they are at certain locations, for example, how are they talking about these locations? Are they happy, or are they bored, or things like that? And the same you can do, of course, for image and sound, or you can search by shape, or you could like search by sound, or you could like, you know, with video analyzers, you could search for certain gestures within a video, things like that. But sometimes it's also interesting to make like a tool for a tool. So, for example, this tool where we use like this book from Jonathan Firm, we analyze not only the content of the book, but also like all information that was available on, for example, Amazon, like all the reviews, but also the reviews about the reviews, but then also like all other information, meta information we could find on the internet. And all this together, if you combine all this information, you kind of get like a fingerprint of of the information, which is not useful for us because it's a way too complex shape, but it's useful for computers, because if you would do this for every book, here it's done for 2 books, for example, then it's way easier to recommend you another book based on many more factors than just like, if other people have read the same book. In 2 years ago, we wrote this book with Casey Rees and Chandler McWilliams, which is about using code and how you can create form with that. And there was a real pleasure to make it, to dive into the history of how form and code can help design. And so I can really recommend it to all of you. Available on Amazon. And there's a accompanied website to it that explains all the code. And so we use code a lot for actual graphic design, to make like still paper stuff, because I'm not saying that paper will disappear, things like this. But things are definitely changing. And for example, in this book we used we checked like how often does every word appear compared to like the uniqueness of every word. And then you create like a grayscale of the words, so you get like an extra layer on top of like the text. Or here, for example, where like the word is directly generated from the actual content. So you take a word, and then it searches on Google for related words, and that creates the typeface. Or here you see, like for an exhibition, we had to make like a catalog, and the only thing we printed was with Iris Print were these stacks of A3 papers. And if somebody wanted to have like a catalog, you just had to press on the button on the machine, and it would generate a catalog. But it would not only take the information from the exhibition, but it would add information that is found on internet at that moment about the artist or about the exhibition or about related stuff, etc. So every catalog was like unique. And also it was a kind of like a fingerprint of the moment you visited the exhibition. Or here we were asked to like make a new interface for how you could read the news for a Dutch newspaper. And what we did was we just took Google News and analyzed the news for each country to find out about like how positive or negative the news for each country was. And well, if we average that out, you get this image. Of course, because it's Google News, it tends to be that most Western parts are quite green and other. So it also shows a little bit how relative we should take the news, of course. And if you put that in like more like a spectrum, you can kind of see how the balance of the world is at what moment, or even as an archive. But sometimes it's also nice to use very analog things for digital ideas. So this is actually like we play a bit with like Google Street View, where we took pictures on a square in Lisbon, and I think like 3 weeks later we printed these pictures and put them back on that place, where you play a bit with like the notion of time. Like when we look at Street View in Google, it's not live, of course. It's like, but it looks like it's now. It looks like we can look in somebody's garden almost, but we can't. And then we added even another layer where people can take a picture with an app, so you get this recursion effect. And the funny thing is that people started to take pictures from that again. But for example, in this project, the Urban Echo, we did make like a live system where you can connect several cities with each other. So there's no sound, but it's kind of like a window towards like another city, where you're more aware of that. You're not the only one living in the cocoon of this city. There's a large world around us with many more people. And this, for example, was how because we're very interested also how you make like information tangible again. And here we used like for a festival for experimental art, we connected the 2 main festival places with creating like a 600-meter long landing strip between those 2 areas.
Attention, all passengers joining flight Claudia.
So the data for the festival was actually used to define when the lights and the sound in the 600-meter long street were turned on and off. So you create like an architectural piece, but it's actually based on the data of the festival. And the same with the idea is like with this. It is an interactive like soccer ball where we put a sensor inside the ball, and when people start playing with this ball, we can track what is happening with the ball. So like, where is it exactly? How fast is it going? What's the acceleration, etc., etc. So we use this data to create new kinds of visualizations. Like here, you can see what happened where on the field and what intensity. And yeah, in a simple way, you can see like, you know, this was not such an interesting game, and this was a way more interesting game already. But also, like, for example, here we use like dazzle patterns to create like T-shirts out of the data. So for each player, got his own T-shirt, so you could kind of see how interesting he played the game, or not. Well, same with the Posterwall that's now up in the exhibition, where it's really about like merging and personalizing messages in automated design. So what it does, it searches on internet for all kinds of data. That can be like local data, that can be cultural data, etc., etc. And by doing so, we use, let's say, kind of a scripts to create, like, automatically create posters. So of course it does ask like questions as in terms of like, you know, what is the role of the designer in this? But I think the most interesting about this is more like how we experience like this kind of like ways of communicating on the street. So in a way you could say, it produces more like a digital vernacular. By making these hundreds of posters per day. And you can even like send a tweet towards it, and it will actually generate a poster with your tweet. Or you can capture a poster by scanning its QR code, and then it sends it to your cell phone, and then you can share it again on one of your social networks. So it's more like a trigger for something that comes after that. A poster is not more anymore than just a small trigger for something after that. So transforming data into information, information into knowledge, and knowledge into stories. So the last thing I just quickly want to show you is like all these huge amounts of data that are around us. Like for example, 24 hours of YouTube video is being uploaded every minute. It's just insane. But also in our physical world, all these RFID tags or location tags, there's so much stuff in the physical world. This is in South Korea, where there's like a shop in a metro station where you basically just scan your what you want to buy, and then it's delivered in the evening. But also the networks that we're working with are changing. Like now we have like the big provider in the middle, but soon we don't have that anymore. So it basically means that everything is going to be connected to everything. Like now, I'm like, if I send the email, it first goes to like this provider, and then it's being sent back. But if I just want to send something to you, why not? Why is it not being sent directly? So imagine when all this is connected to each other. Then, for example, one of the questions we ask ourselves is, then what happens when all this information lands down on Earth, and it really starts to merge the digital and the physical world? So in this installation that we did together with designer Pieke Bergmans, we made a table with 13 lamps, and each lamp is driven by information on internet. So the information is on internet is interpreted in like emotions and things like that, and the motions of the lamps are created by this information. And they also have their own social network where they try to communicate with each other this information. So it's more like, you know, what happens when we put this, when the internet is in everyday objects. And right now in the Centre Pompidou, we made a new version of this where two lamps are trying to communicate with each other. So they share information that they receive. So, for example, one is connected to what's happening in the Paris metro stations, and the other one is, for example, looking at what Barack Obama is doing or stuff like that. And it's trying to share this information. When they have something in common, they will also do something in common. So it's just a metaphor of an everyday object, and it's trying to see like how you can design like data visualizations more in a very, let's say physical way. Because to end with like a very Dutch image, this one, always very curious when I look at these animals. You know, you really want to know what he's thinking. But I'll never know. But still, you're trying to like think of ways of being inspired. And I think, this is a very important thing for graphic designers, to always look ahead a little bit and try to find out, okay, what could be a new form of how people communicate with each other, and how can that actually help the world make a little bit better. So, thank you so far.
Thank you, Dimitri. All I can say is wow. And thank you, Andrew, for organizing what I think is one of the most cutting-edge exhibitions a design museum could be doing right now, just simply because so much is happening in this field that has just transformed immensely. And as we were talking earlier, Andrew, you mentioned that when you started, hardly anyone even knew, years ago as a graphic designer, hardly anyone even knew what graphic design was. So, huge.
It's really exploded, and that was due to the the introduction of personal computer, because that demystified the process and the tools and all access too. Because graphic design, in the Netherlands, I don't think it's licensed either. So it's already an open kind of market. And so once you have those tools widely disseminated, and then, of course, the harder thing was the language and the process, maybe, the thinking that goes behind some of that making. But then you see evidence of that. And some of the examples I thought were, pretty sophisticated, from people who are not trained as designers, making work that most people would assume, when they look at it, they would say that's designed,
Well, I know that the Walker Art Center's their logo is included in the exhibition, and how
I didn't pick it.
No, it's very, very beautiful. I as a curator, I looked at it and I thought, would this make the cut? And it's beautiful, and I love the way how it carries through from the letterhead to the bags to the tape that you use as.
That's an example of a tool for an identity program.
Yes, yeah.
So it uses, it loads like a font, so it appropriates font technology software, and so you treat it more or less like a font, but instead of like when you type B, you might get a bold B. Instead, you get an entire word. And then, so instead of bold and italic, we have like different registers of semantic language, so like language that's used to the public, that's more colloquial, versus language that's more like from business to business, like more institutional speak. So like an example would be like film video is the name of a department internally, but like movies would be an example of a more colloquial kind of term about what they do. So, and so the designer can use that tool, but they can also add words or add, the other part is textures and patterns, which had a little bit to do with their new building and the architect's work there, but you could upload new textures and patterns. And we had a typographer who was originally a graphic designer and then entered font design, right? That's how we have font designers now, because of the computer and software release. So they've engineered it to figure it out for us. So
very fresh.
Yeah.
How does your role as a practicing designer affect your vision as a curator?
In this case, I think it actually helped because because you're really immersed in the field, so like I'm familiar with Les' work now for many years, and it's always hard to pick projects. They're all so good. Like, why didn't we show that one? Why didn't? But so you're familiar with the field, and so that also breeds its own dangers because you're familiar with a certain aspect of the field. Although, so for the show, I didn't mention it, but we also had multiple curators. So it was not just Ellen and I. So like the magazines were curated by Jeremy Leslie, who is an editorial consultant out of London, and he runs a blog called Mag Culture. And then the film titles and television titles were curated by Ian Albinson, who runs another website called Art of the Title. And so I think all of our other curatorial contributors actually ran websites and blogs, which was not intentional, like we didn't just look at that area, but it was coincidental, but not surprising, because again, these are people who are not officially curators, but they know a lot about a specific part of the culture. Like graphic design is so big that Ellen and I couldn't know, every hot new magazine being released. But Jeremy is, because he runs that blog, is like a clearinghouse for all of this information. So it made sense to tap into these sort of non-professional, I guess, curator types, but experts in their subject matter, though.
Dimitri, while the Posterwall is still fresh in our memory, What tell us about the role of beauty and aesthetics in creating that wall, and not only that wall but your work in general? And were you striving for, what were you aiming for, a more traditional kind of beauty, or a new kind of beauty?
Well, the way we work is not necessarily that we work towards a certain aesthetic. It's more we're trying to create tools that kind of do the work for us. Sounds like we're lazy designers, but it's actually more the opposite. Often it's referred to as like process-based design. So we think it's very interesting to do a lot of research for each project, to really dive into like every little detail that you can think of that somehow has to do something with the project, and put all that into a development phase where you try to create like the tools that actually create the aesthetics for you. A little bit like how a lot of the most successful websites are not really designed websites. It's basically like they're designed by a community, by a lot of people together. And I think also many pieces in the exhibition. We have to find a way how you involve your audience in creating the work, and it becomes almost like a common piece for everybody. So not necessarily my aesthetic, but more like a shared aesthetic.
That's a really important point, because we didn't really mention it, but the idea that design used to be the creation of discrete artifacts, and it was the full embodiment of that gesture. But now design is, the easiest tagline I have is like designing design, so that you're designing frameworks for actions to happen in which you can have multiple inputs, whether they're algorithmic from a computer programmer or whether they're actual physical contributions. And then so the design shifts its focus from the discrete object where the control is about the final outcome to this other more process-based approach in which you can't prescribe the outcomes. It might be beautiful, it might be ugly.
Of course, you're still the director, so you're still in charge of the end result. So you define the rules that define the work and everything. Exactly. So, and this is of course important, but you have to go a bit further than just being a graphic designer. So sometimes you're indeed like a producer, or sometimes you're maybe like more industrial designer, sometimes
a psychologist.
Definitely, yeah.
But it seems like it's really leading to some new aesthetics.
Yeah, that I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, it's not something you do on purpose. It's something that just happens, and that it's because of these new tools that also new aesthetics will appear. For sure.
Yeah, it's kind of the parameters of that. This is the transformations in artistic practice too in the 20th century, when more conceptually based or process art would open itself up to a variety of outcomes, and that sort of pluralistic kind of diversity is also congruent, I think, with the current moment, right? So, but there is this other overlay because there are decisions being made, and
in fact, one of the things that struck me about the exhibition is that it seemed like a lot of the works were created without a client. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something really new, because I always associate design as designers as working from a design brief, and as you say, controlling the final product. But in this exhibition, in fact, there were a lot of works that are very experimental, that were initiated by designers themselves, and that's a very big change.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's. I think as a designer, it's important to take the initiative to really try to find like not only your personal way of designing, but also like the tools you want to use, etc. And so like a lot of projects I showed were self-initiated, but it doesn't mean. You need to live from something. So a lot of this like knowledge that you develop, you can use, of course, in commissioned projects. So it's an interesting balance between like making sure you always also kind of like innovation within the profession and at the same time use that for other projects. So.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest transformation in terms of professional practice, because it used to be that self-initiated meant either like, oh, that's your student work, or that's your self-promotional brochure or something, But now it's much more complicated. And I think what's interesting is that you find new, in a way, clients, so you find projects, basically. You don't, not necessarily clients even, you find new opportunities, right? Mm-hmm. Like the festival. Yeah. That would have been, in the old days, that would have been some lighting designer and maybe some sound people, but not a graphic designer. So, but the approach is, which you have a long time to explain it, but it's very much a designed experience. Yeah. So for me, when I look at it, it looks like it came from a designer, a graphic designer. Yeah. And I think that's what the moment for graphic designers is, that the skill sets and the knowledge that they have and the thinking that goes behind a lot of the projects and the end goal of communication and creating that experience is the most powerful. And that's what I can see the difference too, also in a lot of data visualization projects. Because a lot of them are, being webcasts, but some of them are not so interesting because they're not, they just kind of are what they are. Like, here's some data and I made it do this, and it's like, okay. But it needs to have something more interesting to it, I think.
Yeah, you really, I think as a designer, you really try to find a way, like what's in between, like this, like your audience and like the data, or what's in between like man and machine, what's in between like a client and its customers, or et cetera, et cetera. And with all the new, not only like new developments in technology, but also developments in society, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, you have to. I think that's something you have to be very aware of as a designer, and try to play with that, make it also fun again.
Yeah, and as you said, like in the show, there's like many different. There's almost like different philosophies about it. There's like this American, what I think of as being particularly American approach, which is this very entrepreneurial. Mm-hmm. Like I will, and so the short story here is that graphic designers, for example, were called upon to create brand identities for business people with ideas for new products, for example. And so they're very good at doing that and make them very successful. And then a lot of them in America were thinking, well, I have ideas too when I become my own client. And so they've become pretty successful at selling these products because of that experience. Whereas in Europe, it has a slightly different flavor, I think, right now. It's more of a project-based kind of, I'll find the commission opportunity, and it's more project-based. It's more integrated into the kind of culture and society. Yeah.
Dimitri, much is said about the digital dematerialization of design, but creating software is truly a craft. And can you speak to the craftsmanship behind the work you do?
Yeah, that's definitely an important thing. That like how we are trained as designers, that's definitely changing too. I mean, it's like I said, it's not only the aesthetics anymore, but suddenly you need to be like a highly skilled programmer, or which. Yeah, most designers are not. So we have to find like a way how these disciplines get together. And that's one of the reasons why we, for example, started like a lab next to like the design studio, to develop also this hard-end software ourselves, but still with the aim to be very free in experimenting with this. It's good. It's pretty rare to find like a designer that's a good designer and a good programmer. So I think you will see more and more like teams of designers that actually form for projects.
Well, one of the we often get a lot of students at these events, and we frequently hear, and just professionally, a lot of students ask for advice. I mean, it seems like such a pluralistic time right now in terms of studies and and because there's such an interdisciplinary approach, how would you advise a young student today interested in studying graphic design about charting their course of study?
Well,
because you've been what was not mentioned earlier is that Dimitri was a teacher for a long time at the Eindhoven Academy.
Yeah, I've taught at several academies, and both art academy and postgraduate studies. And I also have both myself. I have both an art academy background and an industrial engineering background, so that helped a bit with being also a programmer. But I think as a student, you just have to find your own way. I mean, your study is basically just like a large piece of inspiration, but the real work has to be done by yourself. I mean, you have to find out okay, what part of the design process is where is my passion, and where can I do my thing? Because you can't have all talents in one person. I wish it was possible, but you also have to be realistic. So you also look at with whom do I want to cooperate, and how do I want to produce my stuff. So you have to look a bit, I think, in a broader perspective than maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
something to add.
Yeah, well, as a former teacher.
Yeah.
A different era, though. But no, I agree that the specificity is what seems to differentiate. Because, you have all these choices, and, there's all of these variations of design, within just graphic design, all of these different possibilities. So if you find a place, a focal point, then sometimes that helps, I think, because if you're kind of in the sea of possibilities and you're in a program that's a sea of different options, I think I don't know if you can get where you need to get in that precious time that you have in those few years that you have to be able to have something. So sometimes I think some interesting things come out of really, really tight programs where they're almost reacting against something like a typography program, and then suddenly you get interesting illustrators, who would have thought, because they're more or less put into a specific context. Whereas if you have a menu approach, that's kind of, maybe that's just me personally, it would be confusing to me personally.
I think it could be overwhelming. By the way, we do like audience participation at these events, and so I'd like to remind the audience we've got 2 microphones here, and we welcome your questions. And if you do come up and ask a question, please begin by introducing yourself. Are there any questions? Okay.
Hi, my name's Emily Langlein. I was just wondering if you think with technology, people are becoming more reliant on it and almost lazy in a sense. I was just wondering what your opinion is on that.
Well, I think we've ever been lazy, so that's not going to change. But well, I think for me, it's not such a big deal. I think as mankind, we've always made ourselves dependent on all kinds of things, on whether it was energy or technology. But it's our own choice. So I think it's also a challenge to see how to deal with that. And I'm not afraid that we're losing control or anything, because I think the smarter the tools, the smarter we can make tools. Also, it makes us smarter. So in that sense, I think we'll always be ahead of the tools that we're making.
I just feel like when you showed that child playing with the iPad, I think it frustrates my generation a lot that children today are not going out in the streets and playing sports as much as they used to, and they weren't grown up the same way we were. So we feel like they're going to have that cutting edge in technology even more than we were, because computers didn't come to us until we were 13, 14, so it just changes their mindset as well, I guess, I feel.
No, for sure. But why would you want to have why would you want that the next generation is like you? I mean, I think the next generation should be completely different from you and from me. So I actually see it as a challenge. I'm sure they're going to find their own ways how, for example, to physically express themselves. But
Right.
I'm actually pretty jealous that I didn't have an iPad when I was 3 or something.
And it's not, because some of the stuff I showed with the analog stuff is all revival, basically. So I don't think people would have predicted that if you went, if you thought about it, it's just like they just kept getting more and more alienated from, hands-on production. Because now it's what's in vogue, at least in my, in my city, is like letterpress is particularly strong in silk screening. And it's from a really young people to do this work. And I don't think that seems counter this idea that it just gets, it just continues. And I think one thing that you brought up too is the addressable object. That screen fascination is right now because of things like iPad and iPhone, which actually aren't that huge. It wasn't like we sent someone to the moon. I mean, it was it was pretty much predicted a long time ago. So, but addressable objects and how do you integrate technology into the actual physical environment? That I think maybe they'll get back out into the street because it'll be perceived as being more ubiquitous and common. That's my optimistic
kids that are
theory.
3, they're going to laugh at themselves when they see their movies back. Like, oh, look, when I was 3, I was playing with my finger on a screen.
Thank you.
Oh, that's a question.
I'm William. I'm a designer developer, relatively new to the field. I was wondering, in curating the exhibition, if you were conscious of there being a line between design and contemporary fine art, or whether that's even relevant today.
Oh, in design and fine art, or design as artistic practice, or something?
Or, I mean, because this exhibit was, graphic design. That's how you framed it. There hasn't been an exhibit on graphic design for a while. It seems like some of these projects, especially when they aren't coming from a client brief, that line between what's design and what's art seems to be blurring. Was that a conscious kind of consideration during the curation process, or maybe it's not really relevant anymore?
I mean,
Maybe a challenge too.
Yeah, it kind of raised itself. It depended on the genre because, like actually in the poster section, and I think it's because where you see more of these like self-initiated projects. But I think that makes sense because to me, posters are completely anachronistic as a kind of communication medium. But nevertheless, they're really it's a really still a very vital area of form making, and then in that particular aspect, you see the very digitally based projects, but you also see like the silk screening and all of that. But what they have in common is that almost all of them are self-initiated. But if you go to like the magazine section, those are all like quote unquote real magazines. Some of those are like more niche, but that is the nature of publishing itself, I would think. We have some popular ones, and they're like Bloomberg Business Week and more, things you find on the newsstand, not on the specialty stand. But I think that's just the nature of like where you would find probably the most fertile, more cutting edge ideas are going to be in the fringes. Not completely, but pretty much. I think that's from curatorially speaking. And there's plenty of stuff that we didn't show because we didn't know how to show it. That's very much like artistic practice. That's more performance-based, or it's more of an event-based design experience. And we just didn't know how to show something like that would be on display for 3 months and going from city to city. That was a curatorial failing, I guess. But there are some social practices of design that when you look at them, you might think, oh, that's like an art practice. But it's being done by designers, so it could have been in the show, I guess. And some designers don't call themselves designers anymore. Actually, they call themselves artists because I think
a thin line,
it's a very blurred line, and also between technology. I think between programmers and developers and things of design. So there's some people in there that are not trained as designers. Of course, they're programmers and technologists.
Thank you.
I'm Lucille Tanazes, and I'm the graphic designer as well as an educator. one of the most low-tech pieces you had in the show, I was at Governor's Island, was the Daniel Etok piece, where you had the what do you call this? The vitrine, or not, it wasn't really sealed, but you had this vertical markers, and he had, and I don't know if he had essentially put paper and let the markers bleed into the paper. Yeah. I'm curious about the strategy that you and Ellen were trying to achieve by resurrecting a tool that, I guess it's in the same vein as silkscreen, etc. Yeah. But without looking at it as nostalgia. In a way, it was more performance, and I think that's what you were saying, that there were some things you couldn't put up because they were time-based. But in this instance, it was time-based, but did he do the sheets over a period of during the duration of the exhibit at the Walker? Or is that what's happening as well as at Governor's Island?
Yeah, so this piece is called Felt Tip Print by Daniel Etok, and so it's a 284 or 5 marker set. I forgot the company, Letraset maybe makes it, and so those are all like glued facing up with the caps off, and then pieces of paper, large sheets of paper, were placed on them. And so it was a kind of performance, but it wasn't a public performance. He made basically the idea is that you drain all the ink from the markers. So we didn't know how many sheets of paper that would be. He had a kind of rough idea because it depends on a lot of factors. And so when he did it on two different. He did two, like there were two stations. It was kind of like DJing the paper between these two things. But what's interesting, I think, about this that gets to your question is that and he's a designer. He's trained as a graphic designer. Worked as a graphic designer, now considers himself an artist. And so he's in the show, though. And so, but what's interesting, his father was a creative director in advertising. And so he grew up with these kind of marker sets. And I don't think it was nostalgic as much, but I think he was just interested in, how they're still around. Again, this kind of anachronistic thing, this kind of old tool. And then he has done other projects using those, going way back to his graduate school days. He made an edition of a book, for example, where it was done the opposite way, where he made a device that held all the pens facing down onto a full stack of paper. So it was a test about how much bleed through there would be until the ink ran out, and then all of those sheets were folded, like you make a book. So those sheets were folded, and then they were made into a book. So it's about the process. So it's kind of akin to like a lot of process art. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but I'm hopefully that I don't think he wants it to be nostalgic, but it does. It's a memory. It's kind of like a childhood memory of this tool that he has become kind of obsessed with over time.
Yes, please.
My name is Phyllis Rosenblatt, and I teach. I also am a painter, and I've done production graphics. I have a question for you, which is sort of, a puzzler. I don't quite know how to ask it, and it's because I came across an artist who was showing at the new museum, and he was a young artist. He was from South America. And he was interested in doing community-based art. What I found in his work, however, is that he was ultimately reinventing the wheel. And I honestly believe it's because the origin of his impulses didn't originally stem from the desire to make something. It was the desire to do good socially, and it bypassed those physical experiences that we have as children and also as learning designers and artists, where you do have basic aesthetics that you have to grapple with. I'm not sure if this is a question, but I wonder if you still think it's necessary to have basic training.
Basic training in art,
yes.
Like foundation type stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, of course. I mean, but it's like it's just big inspiration. I mean, and I think it's never about technology, or it's never about. It's more. I mean, you don't find, you're trying to like find a form of communication between people. So you're trying to solve like a social problem, not a technology problem. It's just technology is just like a tool. I mean, nothing has changed in that. So you need to get your inspiration. Mainly, I think, from the society around you, and like the people that can train you are usually very good at pointing at you, like where you can find this. So I think, like what I try to teach my students is not necessarily I don't teach them programming, but I do point at them, like in that area, there's people are doing stuff with technology that could be interesting, so check it out. So, but I'm always approaching it from the human point of view. So.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's there's actually some aspects of graphic design now that's basically called social design or social impact design. It's a very big field and lots of different kinds of practices, and some verge into what you're talking about, where the desire to do good doesn't necessarily create the most interesting work, to be blunt. Yeah, and it's still visual and it's still design, and but I want it all. I want it smart. I want it beautiful, or at least provocative, and I want all of that stuff. I want it well crafted, and I'm not willing to compromise on anything less than that.
But agreed that those are educated goals.
Yes. Yeah, and some people, and I don't know if you were talking about like the amateur or those cases though that I found and that we would show are people who are, I think you would agree that if you've taught for long enough, there's always people out there who basically, we like to think as teachers we have this magic, but basically it's on the student, I think, originally, and they will flower in any kind of context. And I think that's true for a lot of people that enter the design, that the kinds of like untrained that we're showing, they have a real kind of expertise, their own kind of knowledge. Sometimes that's just a particular process that's repeated thousands of times that we might call craft or something, that makes it really compelling at the end. That's what their work is really. That's kind of at the heart of it. And then some people are just super smart, really great ideas. It's it's good enough. It's not about the form. So I think as curatorially, you want to be kind of as flexible as you can. But personally, I like certain standards around what I expect out of a piece or project. Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? All right, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground this evening, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and I'd like to thank our two panelists who flew in specifically for this event, and I think gave us a very rich evening and exposed us to a very exciting new area of design, and specifically graphic design. And I would like to welcome all of you to Governor's Island this summer. Treat yourself both to the exhibition and the island. They're both free, as is a ferry over there. So,
free, the best.
Take your friends. Thank you very much.
Thank you.